Hello everybody and welcome to the second video in the Plainchant for Beginners series. Before we start the video, I just wanted to show you this. This is very exciting. Some of the technology that I've had to get my head around to film these videos. Look at that! Astonishing! It's like when you put two mirrors next to each other. Oh, wonderful. So many of me. I could do a synchronized dance. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that before we start. As you can see, thankfully my head has kind of been pushed aside to a corner of the camera, of the screen rather, and the screen is now taken up by some Plainchant. So today we'll be diving straight into it and looking at how this notation works and some of the underlying principles behind it. We'll also be dipping our toes into the world of music theory just for some essential concepts that we need before we can be on our way and sing lots of this lovely Plainchant. If you've come directly from the first video, then I take my hat off to you because you made it through 17 whole minutes of me going on about the history of Gregorian chant, which is wonderful, you deserve a medal. If instead you decided to take my suggestion on board and start with this one, then that's absolutely okay. As you can see, we're just going to be getting on with it and looking at some of this notation. Without further ado then, here is the Salve Regina. It's the solemn tone, so it's the hard version. There's an easy version. This is the hard version. And don't worry, we're not going to be singing this just yet. I just wanted us to have a look at a typical piece of Plainchant and how it's built. So we can see that there are two elements then to this notation. First of all, we've got the text, as you can see. So going left to right, you've got the text. Quite normally, you read it from left to right, of course. The only difference is that it's split into some of the syllables, and we'll go into that later. And that text is running along underneath what's the musical element, which is the subject of most of this video, on top of it. Now, this operates on two basic directions. Left to right is the direction in which we read it, like the text, and then you've got up and down. And the lower that a note, a little symbol is, the lower in pitch it is. And the higher that it is, conversely, the higher in pitch it is. Now remember, if you watched the first video, and if not, this will be new to you, which is okay, that I discussed at the very, very early stages of Plainchant how people who sang it used symbols to notate how the melodies went as a kind of memory aid, because they knew them all off by heart. And so the very first notation was just a series of scribbles on top of the text. And so if it went up, then that meant that your voice went up, and if it goes down, the voice goes down. And the obvious limitation to that is that you don't know, well, how far up does the voice go? How far down should I sing? And then as it got more developed, this notation developed what we know as the stave. So if you look at these four lines, these four horizontal lines that are running across the music, that is what's known as the stave, S-T-A-V-E. And if you can read modern music, then you will be slightly surprised in that this is a 4-line stave instead of a 5-line stave, which we use in modern music. And those staves tell us exactly which note we're singing. So you can see that a dot, which is the basic symbol of a note, it can either go on a line, such as here, on top of ve, can you see that dot is on the line, or it can go on a gap. So if you look at here, on ma for mater, it's on the gap that's beneath the 4th line. Similarly on cor, you can see you've got a little dot that's on a gap. So think about the stave then, like a ladder. You've got the ladder and then you've got its rungs, and you can put a note either on the rung or on the gap, which means that actually you've got quite a lot of notes there to explore on this 4-line stave. If the 4 lines aren't enough, if you look all the way down here, gementes et flentes, if those 4 lines aren't enough, then you can always just add another line for one note. Can you see here on ge of gementes, there's another long line that's just an extension of those 4 lines if you need a really low note. You can also do that for very high notes as well. So, this is called square notation, and the clue is in the name because every note is conveyed by a square. So it is at the simplest level. If you look at here, for example, et spes, you've got a little square for et, so that tells you what pitch you sing et on, and then spes, that tells you what pitch you sing spes on. Very simple. You will also notice that there are some more complicated symbols that aren't just squares, but they've got wiggles and things, they've got other elements. And that is in case you need to sing more than one pitch on a syllable. So it's a kind of singing figure of more than one pitch, and that's what's known as a melisma. So you've got either syllabic settings, and syllabic just means that you've got one pitch per note, or you have got melismas, where the voice ondulates and you spend a bit of time singing through the notes for one syllable. Here you've got a mix of both. I'll just show you an example of plain chant notation at its very simplest. And now, I don't know how long this video has been going, but by this stage we can already do some singing. If you look here, this is a setting of the Confiteor, the I confess that we say at Mass. You also say it in the office, you say it at Compline. Now, can you see that for every single syllable of this Latin text, that you've got a dot? Okay, and if you just take a look at all of the dots, you'll notice that they're all on the same space. They're all on this line. That's the second line from the top. So there's nothing complicated in this particular chant. You've got no melismas, so none of these flourishes, all on the same note. Okay, and if you were to sing that, I can demonstrate that for you now. It would sound like this. Confiteor Deo omnipotenti et vobis fratres, quia peccavi nimis cogitatione, etc., etc., etc. So can you see that for every syllable that I said, I was making one sound, and that sound was the same all the way through. And that's known as a recitation. So that, in its simplest form, is the plain chant notation. Some of the syllables are split up with a dash and some of them aren't. Don't ask me why that is. There are rules in Latin, depending on the editor, of which ones get a dash and which ones don't. The honest answer is I have no idea. It doesn't really matter anyway. Yeah, you just have to look at each note, and then underneath it is its syllable, or look at the syllable on top of it is each note. Another thing that we can see is that there are little vertical dashes, and they vary in size. So we have the tiny little one here after T, omnipotent T, tiny little thing, and that's a breath mark, so that just tells you where to breathe. Breathing is essential to singing. Without it, we can't sing. Well, we can't do very much without breathing, but it's especially important for singing. And then you've got the middle breath here after fratres, and that's just a slightly longer breath. And then we've got the full line here after omissione, and that is the kind of the end of the phrase, really. And then right at the very end of the piece, you've got the double line. So that's quite simple. They start off small, and then they get bigger, longer, and then you get the double one at the end. Okay, now, before we go on then, let me just, sorry for scrolling, but let me just find the Salve Regina again. Here we go. Before we go on into it, just looking at what these symbols are, and how to decipher some of these melismas, we've not answered the question yet of which note. You know, how do I know what that note over there is and what that note over there is? It could just be, it could be any note, couldn't it? The guide is the clef. Notice how I called it the guide. That's an important concept. So this little thing that looks like a C over here at the beginning, and it's in the beginning of every line, that's called the clef, which comes from the French word meaning key. It's like the key in a map. It tells you where north is. And this one that looks like a C simply enough tells you where C is. So if C is on this very top line, okay, then we can work out where all the other notes are with relation to that line. Now, here is when we have to, I'm going to change tab, here is when we have to start looking at some very essential music theory on note names, C's, B's, octaves, intervals. We're going to cover all of those things just so that we can get an essential understanding before we go on. So, musical sound, like everything, like colours, like distance, all kinds of things, we have made it into a system. We found a way of organising it, categorising it, labelling it. And so the most essential thing to grasp at the moment is the concept of the octave. If I were to sing a note, and then I were to ask a female member of a choir, let's say the Scholar at Fisher House, to sing the same note, so say a C, okay, chances are that we would sing the same note but an octave apart. So what does that mean? That means that she would be singing it higher because her voice might naturally be higher than mine, but it would sound so similar that we could be calling it the same note. On a keyboard, that is seen through the repetitions of the patterns. So can you see that this keyboard is structured in a way that you've got 2 black notes and then a gap, and then 3 black notes and then a gap, and then it repeats. 2 black notes and then a gap, 3 black notes and a gap, 2 black notes, 3 black notes. Now, in every repetition of that pattern, okay, the same note in its equivalent place, okay, is going to be the same as the next repetition or the previous repetition, just that an octave apart. So let's find this note. So for example, this note that we've called A, that's in between these 2 black notes. So if I play it, and then if I play the one that's an octave above, so you can see, let's find the same 3 black notes and then the same white note. If I play them both, they sound very similar. And I think that with this I can even play them at the same time. So if I do that, play, can you see that they sound so similar that they're the same note? That's why we call them both A's, and they're the octave apart. So those are the kind of yardsticks between all the sounds that we can make with the human voice. Now, in between that octave, we have other notes. So between A and A, can you see that we've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 7 different notes before you get the next A. Okay, so I'll just play those for you. And then you get the same thing again. Oopsie. Now, for now, all that we need to know is that in the West we use these 7 notes. We split the octave. Okay, we split it into 7. That we put gaps between these 7 notes to create what's known as a scale. Okay, and that this scale is comprised of 2 different intervals. So we've got the distances between the notes, and we call them either a whole step or a half step. Now I might be going very quickly and this might be very confusing for you, but let's just look at this keyboard and I'll try to explain what I'm saying. The distance on a piano keyboard between any note and its next note, including the black keys, so for example this A and the black key next to it, that is a half step, and that's the smallest type of gap that we can have in Western music. Similarly, if I start on this black note and go to the note next to it on the right, which is this one, called B, that's also a half step. However, what's the distance if I want to go between this A and this B? That is, well, you've got 1 step to go to that one, and then another half step to go to that one, and 2 half steps make a whole step. So, from A to B, we have what is known as a whole step. we don't need to use any of the black notes for the moment for our plain chant. So we're just thinking about these black notes in order to work out what's going on with the white notes. In plain chant, we only use the white notes, so don't worry about the black notes. So, whole step from A to B, because it's 2 half steps. Now, from B to C, if we just look at this, there's no black note between B and C. So that means that between B and C, it's just another half step. It can't be smaller than a half step, and then because it doesn't exist, and then it can't be bigger than a half step because there's no black note in between them. There's nothing in between this B and C. So that's why we've got the gaps on the keyboard. So we've got a half step between B and C, and then if we want to go on from C, we've got another black note again. So then a half step, and then another half step. So from C to D, much like with A to B, we've got another whole step. Okay? So we've got half steps and whole steps, and between the white notes, which are the only ones that we're using, there are 2 instances of the half step. We've just covered one between B to C, and you might have spotted that the next one is between E and F. Okay? And apart from that, the rest are whole steps. So, going back to this notation, the reason that we have this clef on C isn't so that we know that we have to sing that note to this C of the piano. It's not that, because sometimes in plain chant we have to sing it a bit higher or a bit lower, depending on the voices that you've got, depending on the time in the morning. At 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, we often have to sing it quite low. So it's not that. This C is movable. It depends on where our voices lie. The point of this clef is to tell us where the half steps are. So if we zoom in on here, is that as far as I can go? I think so. You've got C on this line, okay, and then you've got B, because we remember the lower you go, you go down. You've got B on the gap below, and if we look at our keyboard, between C and B, there's a half step, okay? That half step, doo-doo. If it were a whole step, it'd be doo-doo. Can you see it's bigger? Doo-doo, doo-doo. Anyway, you've got the half step here between C and B, doo-doo. And then B, underneath B you get A, doo. And we know from the piano that you've got a whole step between B and A. Now, once we get to the bottom, once we get to A and we have to keep going down, notice that because we've only got 7 notes in the octave and we've used 7 letters, okay, once you go into the next octave, you've got to start on G again, yeah? So you go A, G, F, E, D, C, B. A, that's 1 octave, you've gone through that, you've gone down, and then you start another octave, you start on G again. So, if we translate that into our notation, we've got C, B, A, yeah, on this line, and then we keep going down to G again, G, and then F and E. Now remember, F and E is where we have another half step on the piano keyboard. Okay, so between this line and this gap, that's another one of the half steps that we have to remember. Okay, and then E, D, C, and we reached a C, and this C right at the bottom of the stave on this gap is an octave lower than the C all the way up here. Okay, so don't worry if that doesn't make very much sense for the time being, but just remember that the point of the clef is so that you get the intervals, so the gaps between the notes, in the right order. Say if I were to change this clef from this place here at the top line, if I were to change the clef, which you can do, and I were to put it here on the second line, that would completely change all the intervals, because here, as it stands at the moment, you've got the C and the B, top line and the top gap. That's where your half step is. But if I were to change the clef, then that wouldn't be a half step, that would be a whole step, and the half step instead would be on the second line and the gap beneath it. Okay? Anyway, clefs are there, they tell you where C is. And for the moment, we'll be using the keyboard C, just so that we can understand what those intervals sound like. Moving on then, I promise this will get easier. Let's move on for the time being. on to some of these symbols. Now, they might look complicated, but let me reassure you that they're not. When you have a syllabic setting, so if we go back to our confiteor, all the way up here, if I can find it, there you go, a confiteor, then you've just got dots. You've got the punctum in Latin, it just means a dot. Okay, so that's one pitch for every syllable, you've got this dot. Now, sometimes you can have more than one sound for each note. So if we go to the beginning of this booklet, here we have the music that you sing at the beginning of Compline, of night prayer. Now, let me just sing you this very first line. So here I've got the C clef. I start on C, so I'm going to go to my piano, find a C, and I'll start singing. So, see if you can spot what's going on around here. So, Deus in adiutorium meum intende. I'll sing it again. Deus in adiutorium meum intende. Did you spot that on tor of adiutorium, I sang two notes? Torium, a lower note and then a higher note. That is shown in this notation with this. And if you look at it, you can just see that you've got a dot for the lower note, do, and then above it you've got a dot for the high note, do, do, torium. So that's simple enough. That's for when you need two notes and to be sung to the same syllable. Similarly, you can have, see if I can find it. There we go. You can have a high note and then a low note, so the other way around. Here we got it in festina. Ad adiuvandum me festi, do, do. High note and then a low note. The symbol for that is just your high note on a dot. It's got a line on the side, but ignore the line on the side. You've got your high dot, in this case on a line. In this case it's on G. No, it's not, it's on A, because you've got C over here. C, B, A, so that's an A on the line. Okay, A to G. Good. So those are our symbols for two notes. And then, what else do we need to know? Let's go back to this Salve Regina all the way here at the bottom. There we go. So once we know that, we can start spotting quite a lot of these. So here you've got the ones going down. There you go, on Re here, from an A to a G. Here on Misericordie. On Ri, it goes up. See, so that sings two notes on Ri, two notes on Mi. These ones are going down, these ones are going up, etc., etc. Now let's look at another symbol. Let's look at this one on Salve. So here on Salve, you've got to sing 1, 2, 3, 4 notes. The first one is a punctum, very simple, and then you've got to sing 3 notes in this symbol that's called a porrectus. You don't need to know that it's called a porrectus, it's just a fancy word that you can throw into conversation. So you've got the beginning here, and then you've got the lower note at the end of this little bend. So it starts here on the line, then you've got this other note here in the gap, and then it goes back up to the note on the line again. So it's 3 notes, 1, 2, and 3. That's because it's easier for the scribes to do. You start a thing, and then instead of doing a separate one, you just join them together, and then back up you go. Okay, that's that, and then we have another punctum, another dot, and then a descending thing, and then on G, here we have one note here. Ignore the line, we've got this dot on the gap, and then these 2 diamond-shaped notes. Again, it's just because scribes were lazy, and instead of writing it like that with your pen, it was easier to tilt your pen and just do little dots like that. Okay, so then you've got on G 1, 2, 3 in that order, and then you've got a squiggle. We'll talk about the squiggle later, and then back up you go to the line and the gap. So can you see that you just read it, you just read the dots. It begins to look a bit less complicated when you realise that you just go left to right, look at where the dots are, on the line, on the gap. Okay, and now that we know where C is, we can start working out where these gaps and where these lines are on the keyboard, where the intervals are, and we can start singing it. Before I do that, maybe just another symbol. On D, misericordiae, here can you just see dot, dot, dot? You've got 3 of them. So on D, you sing D. Instead of singing 2, you sing 3 on D. Perhaps as a way to finish then, I know that this has been very dense. Don't worry if you don't quite understand everything just yet. What I'll do is I'll just sing the first line of this Salve Regina chant, and perhaps you can try following it along. And just look, for the moment, don't worry about where the intervals and half steps and whole steps, we'll deal with that together. For the moment, just try and trace the symbols and see what they're doing. Okay? So to finish, here is the first line of Salve Regina in the solemn tone. Salve Regina, Mater misericordiae. Wonderful. Take care and see you in the next video. Ta-ra.